Hello, this is John with SentientLight.com. This is part 2 of PEMF, Electroporation, and Covid-19. Now we're going to go into the science of PEMF. We're going to go through the information step by step, and each principle will build on top of each other, and this will help us understand the big picture of how PEMF works. The first thing that we're going to look at is how electrons work. So up on the screen we have a battery and a light bulb. You can see how the electrons leave the negative side of the battery to the light bulb and back to the positive side of the battery. There's a YouTube channel called Into the Ordinary. They did a video called What is Electricity? Electricity Explained. If you're curious how atoms are negatively and positively charged and how that creates electrical current, I would recommend watching this video, and I'll put the link in the description below. Just know that atoms, depending on how many electrons they have, they will either have a positive charge or negative charge. And just like magnets, positive and negative charges attract each other. Another part of science that we're going to talk about is resonant inductive coupling. Resonant inductive coupling is used for wireless power systems, such as portable computers, phones, and vehicles. Alright, so how does this work? I'm going to use a visual to help us understand this. I found a YouTube video called How Wireless Energy Transfer Works.
Run an electric current through a coil of copper wire, and the coil will produce a short-range magnetic field. Place a second coil within this field, and an electric current will flow through it. The magnetic field has transferred electrical power from one coil to the other. This principle is called induction, and it has been understood for more than a century. Induction is what charges a wireless electric toothbrush, for example, and it works well over extremely short distances. Pull the coils apart, and the power transfer ceases. It turns out that the trick to longer distance power transfer is the same principle an opera singer uses to shatter a wine glass from across the room. It's called resonance. For the opera singer, when the frequency of the sound wave matches the unique resonant frequency of a glass, the acoustic energy is converted to kinetic energy at the highest possible efficiency. The energy then builds inside the glass until it shatters. The coils that Witricity uses to transfer power wirelessly are magnetic resonators. First, a rapidly oscillating electric current is applied to a coil at its specific resonant frequency. This creates a magnetic field in the region around the coil. Tune a second coil to the same resonant frequency as the source, and it will couple, resonating anywhere within that region and converting the oscillating magnetic field into an electrical current within the second coil. This response is called highly coupled magnetic resonance. By attaching the second coil to a device, such as the battery of an electric car or a mobile phone, this current can be made to do useful work. The source can be either centimeters or meters away from the device being powered and can deliver power through walls or around metal obstacles. The power can even be distributed across multiple devices at once. So by a simple trick of physics, power is transferred wirelessly.
This is all really cool technology. Here's a guy that made 2 coils and is using the same principle of resonant frequency coupling to light this light bulb. Okay, so far we've talked about some interesting things. Electrons being positively charged and negatively charged. We've talked about wireless energy transfer. All these principles of science have something in common, but to make sense of all this, we need to talk about the anatomy and the physiology of human cells. And there's no better place to learn about this than from a doctor who teaches anatomy and physiology. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ren.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren and this is my channel. I've been studying the human body from a scientific medical perspective for over 20 years, and I've been teaching about the human body for over 10 years.
After looking around on the internet, I found that Dr. Ren did the best in explaining scientific principles in a simple way, where I could understand, and I think you will too. There's a lot that we could learn about a cell, but the part that we want to study is the membrane potential. And here's the video that I'd like to show you.
So what is membrane potential? This drawing is supposed to represent a cell, a human cell. When we're talking about membrane potentials, here's the basics of what we mean. There's a charge across this outside membrane, a literal electrical charge. To understand the basics of how this kind of charge difference works, a good first step is to make sure you understand how the cell membrane is made up. So let's take a quick look at the structure of the cell membrane. If I took a little piece of the cell membrane and blew it up a lot, this is what we think we would see. Phosphate head group, lipid tails, and if I kept drawing this thousands and thousands of times, you could imagine that I could go all around my cell membrane here. That's what this is made out of. But of course, we don't draw it that way because doing that would take forever. What this creates in terms of a barrier, in terms of a semi-permeable barrier, that creates a lipid barrier. These tails hanging out with each other creates a lipid barrier. particles that are polar or charged, they can't get through this barrier easily. Proteins are required in the membrane to allow things like this to pass through. So for example, the two major ions for membrane potential, sodium and potassium, this cell membrane, if it was only made out of phospholipids, these guys wouldn't be able to get through. They'd just bounce right off and they'd stay either outside the cell or inside of the cell. They wouldn't be able to pass across this membrane. Remember I said that in order for these guys to get through, there need to be proteins? The two major proteins for setting up membrane potential. The first one is called the sodium-potassium pump. It literally pumps sodium and potassium across the membrane. In order to do that, it requires energy, and of course the energy currency inside of the cell is ATP, turning it from adenosine triphosphate into adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. The energy from removing that phosphate group is used to do this, to pump out 3 sodiums, and at the same time to pump in 2 potassiums.
Here's an animation of the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium is being pumped out, the potassium is being pumped in, and the fuel for this pump is ATP, just like any pump that you might use in your house. You need some kind of fuel like gas or electricity to run a pump.
This creates a difference in concentration, of course, of sodium on the outside of the cell and potassium on the inside of the cell. Just in terms of our accounting of charges, notice that this sodium-potassium pump has pumped out 3 positive charges, and while it has pumped in positive charges as well, it's only pumped in 2 positive charges. So we already have more positive charge on the outside, less positive charge on the inside. We've got a piece of the negativity going on here. This next protein is called the potassium leak channel, and it does exactly what its name says. It literally allows potassium to leak out. Remember, that's what we were pumping in over here. The sodium-potassium pump pumped out some positive charge. It pumped out more positive charge than it pumped in. And now those positive charges that the sodium-potassium pump pumped in, we're allowing some of those to get out, thus increasing even more the positive charge on the outside and decreasing the positive charge or increasing the negative charges on the inside.
Something I'd like to mention here is the chloride ion. It's negatively charged, and because the sodium and potassium are either being pumped out or leaked out, chloride ion, negative ion, is staying inside the cell. So now we have that potential energy between the inside and the outside of the cell. And this brings us to the next topic of action potential.
Here's what basically happens, and I'll do it on the cell first. During an action potential, some kind of stimulus comes and causes this to happen. The outside becomes negative, the inside becomes positive, and then right after that, very, very quickly after that, we go back to resting. So that's it. That is an action potential. The charge flips and then flips right back again. On my graph, it looks something like this. Some kind of stimulus comes, and that stimulus is basically from somewhere positive charge enters the cell, enough positive charge to cause this negative charge to approach this dashed line. That is what's called threshold. The importance of that, once we reach threshold, there are proteins in this membrane that are going to take care of the rest of it, that are going to flip the charge and flip it back again. And I'll get to those in a little bit. Once we reach threshold, then those proteins in the membrane cause the voltage to go way up to around plus 30 millivolts, and then immediately the charge comes back down and actually becomes more negative than it was at rest, and then we get back to resting potential again. So if we represent an action potential on a graph such as this one, it looks something like this. Let's talk about what happens when we reach threshold, and for that I'm going to change my picture slightly, and I'm going to include the proteins of action potential. Here's my first protein, and then here's my second protein. So once we reach threshold, what causes the membrane to go positive? The membrane goes positive because this first channel, the voltage-gated sodium channel, opens in response to that reaching of threshold. That causes sodium to come into the cell. Sodium is positively charged, so the charge on the membrane, on the inside, the charge goes up, the positive charge goes up. So once we reach threshold, those voltage-gated sodium channels open and we get depolarization, this increase of charge going a lot more positive. And here's what's going to happen. Once we reach this peak of around plus 30, this inhibition gate comes into play and the channel is inhibited. No more sodium gets to come in. So that's why we only get up to plus 30. We don't go any more positive than that, and now we can come back down again. This is a voltage-gated potassium channel, and this one was also signaled to open once we reach threshold, but apparently it takes it just a little bit more time to open than the sodium channel, than the voltage-gated sodium channel takes to open. So this one opens at any rate, and remember that potassium is at a higher concentration on the inside of the cell. So when this gate opens, the potassium diffuses out of the cell. Potassium diffuses quickly out of the cell. That's going to cause the voltage inside of the cell to become more negative because we're losing positive charges. So the membrane potential becomes more negative. Remember that these channels were a little bit slower than the sodium channels. Once we get below threshold, both of these channels are signaled to close again. But we end up being a little bit hyperpolarized here, more negative than we were at rest, because the potassium channel apparently takes a little bit of time to close. So if I take it down here below threshold, we basically go back to the state that these channels were in before we started.
Let's recap with what we've learned. So we've got the sodium-potassium voltage-gated channels. When they reach threshold, they both open. The potassium gate opens slower than the sodium, so a lot more sodium's coming in at first, peaking up at 30 millivolts, and then when the potassium gate opens, all the potassium goes out to equalize inside the cell. So this is the bare bones of action potential of our cells. It plays a huge part in the health of our cells and the communication, as well as contraction of muscles, secretion of hormones. This is like the breath of life in a cellular level. And if we're going to understand pulse electromagnetic field therapy, we have to understand this part of our body, the physiology of action potential. Please stay tuned. Stay with me, guys. I know this is a lot of information, but in the end, it will all make sense. It will all come together. You cannot understand PEMF unless you know about these essential principles of science and biology.